We will now have the pleasure of hearing from Richard W. Hill Sr. Rick, an artist, writer, curator, and professor, is Senior Project Coordinator at the Indigenous Knowledge Center at Six Nations Polytechnic in Ohsweken, Ontario. From 1992 to 1995, Rick served as the Assistant Director for Public Programs and as the Special Assistant to the Director of the National Museum of the American Indian. He has lectured and written extensively on placing Native American art, history, and culture in its proper context, as well as on American Indian Museum issues such as tribal consultation, repatriation, stereotyping, and cross-cultural education. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rick Hill.
It's great to be here. I actually gave Tim his first job in a museum when he was much younger, and I'm amazed to see what he made of himself. Not that I didn't believe he could, but... Well, I'll say, Nyawe Scano, that's a way of Senecas greet one another. It means that I'm thankful that you are well, and that actually applies to all of you. But our concept of wellness also means that you're at peace. Wellness and peace, I believe, at the heart of our cultural aspirations for treaty making. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about the history of this covenant chain and the making of it. So the linking of the arms, this is the concept that was employed before the District of Columbia was ever created. Now I'm a Tuscarora, we follow our mother's side of the family. And we made treaties with the United States. When you think about some of the oldest treaties, of course they were crafted up in Philadelphia. If you go to Philly today, there's this vacant lot in downtown, and they call it the Wampum Lot because that's where our reserved for our leaders when they used to come there to negotiate the terms of these agreements, first with the colonial leaders and then with the president and the early Congress. So maybe in many ways, NMAI has become the Wampum Lot here in Washington, where now we gather together to renew and discuss these materials and what they mean. And so I wanted to give you a quick visual journey. I find it ironic that before the United States was formed, the British always manifested the relationship between them and the colonies as if they were two women. Britannia and then the white colonists were visualized here as natives, naked natives. So in one sense, we see the female combatants in 1776, they're duking it out, Britannia and the native, the white people, and then they finally make it up and start kissing to one another. Ironically, treaty making is very much a man's business. I wonder what would be the nature of our relationship, however, if the Haudenosaunee women and the colonial women had negotiated these agreements. Maybe it would be less about the lust of land. And usually what got us to the negotiating table was a fight. Sometimes we fought on behalf of our allies, and sometimes we had to fight against them. So Wampum Belt became the core medium by which treaties were manifested. We heard a little bit about that. This is a belt that's here in the NMAI collection. And so this war club or the tomahawk that's woven into the belt and a purple belt would indicate we're ready to go to war because of these unresolved matters. And as we see here, this is a British official who's dressed like a native and trying to get us to ally ourselves with the crown. But as was said, the treaty relationship is what's primary. And it is a relationship, as we see here, and that relationship is manifest in this little drawing on a silver pipe that was used, I think, in 1769, of neighbors coming together. Our native nations and the neighbors and other people that are living there, with our permission, we had to negotiate these terms. Notice there's smoke in the pipe, and they actually have this wampum string or this chain between them. So the written documents, some of which we see here, are just momentary pauses in this relationship where people said, what is our expectation of the future? Let's record this. Let's try to come to one mind on the matter. And then as we see in this old print, this was actually one of the Mohawks who went to meet with Queen Anne in 1710, carrying this Wampum Belt message. So it's the interaction between our people, and at least here on the East Coast, wampum was the crux to that. This was a drawing that my ancestors sent over to England in 1890. Even though it's very fuzzy, it's over in the archives in England, but we can see them, the British official in their red coat and the native official holding this chain. So first of all, they're both pointing to the Son because there's a spiritual component to treaty making. We both believed, both treaty partners, that we're there and witnessed by whatever power is above, and that our word given at that occasion therefore was solemn. So I grew up hearing that our treaties are sacred. But when I read them all in English, I said I didn't see much to sacredness in these agreements. They were just a receipt for land fraud. But when you hear the dialogue that took place, they're pledging to each other, and they said God or the Creator, the Great Spirit, is witnessing this pledge, and we're going to smoke this pipe because it'll carry that pledge up to the skies. So this is why they're pointing to the sun. We see the council fire, which was a very real thing, to kindle the fire and speak across it because the fire is supposed to have the power to purify your words. So this drawing reminds us of that. But I take my lead from a friend of mine, John Mohawk. I used to teach at the University of Buffalo for many years. And he's talking about the founders of our Confederacy believed that the greater causes of conflict was injustice. That injustice must be abolished before conditions would exist which could promote peace. So it's about making peace. But it's the injustice that upsets the peace. So in many ways, treaty making is trying to make amends for those injustices that took place. So the reason why we had so many treaty councils, and for the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, that's the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and the Tuscaroras, we had hundreds of treaty meetings with the French, the Dutch, the English, the Americans, and the Canadians, because the injustices continue. We had to find a way to resolve them. So that peace was not simply the absence of conflict or the war that maybe got us there, but the product of sincere and informed negotiations which sought justice as a precondition to true peace. And I believe this is possibly what's missing today. We've got too many lawyers arguing about what the treaty means and not looking at how do we resolve the injustice that took place. Now, we had a protocol for doing that. It was very important in our tradition that whenever our people engaged with colonial leaders, we performed this ceremony. And it was called At the Edge of the Woods. And you think of it, you just took this arduous journey through the woods to get to our place where the treaty council is made. And at the edge of the woods, it's a transformation zone from the darkness into the light. So what we had to do, though, is prepare the mind of the negotiators to be ready to engage with us. And we used these wampum strings, and this was done in 1815, talking about the War of 1812. This is where the British were making their amends back to our people who were involved in that war. Colonel William Claus, who was Sir William Johnson's grandson, offered these words, that your eyes are full of tears, you cannot see clearly, your ears and throat are stopped up, your hearts have been in trouble and grief, your limbs are still covered with mud, your feet are full of thorns, and your seats are covered with blood. This is after the war. So what he's doing is, ceremonially, he's going to cleanse all of that. But the important thing here is the British learned our protocol in doing that. So treaty making was a cultural manifestation of our worldview. So at the edge of the woods, we would do this ceremony whereby we would first take the softest deer skin that we can find. And when you tan a natural deer hide, this is what it looks like. And with this soft skin and with a string of wampum beads like this one here, we would first wipe the tears away from your eyes. Because you're carrying whatever grief, war, causes, trauma. In order for you to see us clearly, we have to take this cloth and wipe those tears away. And then trauma also it's like dust that settles over your body. So the second thing we do, we take the softest feather we can find. And with this feather, we're going to slowly clean your ears out so that you can hear the kind and powerful words that were given. You can also hear the birds sing and be restored. And it kind of uplifts your spirit. And then with the third one, we're going to take some water, back when water was really good. And we would give that to you to wash down this thing that's clogging your throat from speaking well and from nourishing your body. So we uplift your mind, we uplift your spirit, and we uplift your body. And you have to be healthy in order to engage in a healthy treaty process. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but these are words that are important to share on this. And we call it a requickening because it's bringing back to life your treaty partner, the other side of it. You have to be healthy. Now today I'd have to say this is our number one problem. Federal government can't see us, they can't hear us, and half the times they can't talk to us. So this old tradition, it goes back to the foundation of treaty making, maybe it should be restored so that we can have a healthy dialogue. Anyway, so the wiping the tears, pushing the clouds back is important, opening the ears and your throat so you can hear this stuff, but it's also restoring the capacity of the treaty partner to negotiate truthfully and helpfully. And I think that's important. And then we also say that we're trying to straighten up the body. So your heart I replace and remove all the grief and trouble from. Now you got to remember, a lot of these were after actual armed conflicts. But sometimes now, because of colonization, we've all inherited a different kind of trauma. There's a different thing going on by being betrayed by missionaries or government officials or teachers. And so we still have the need to also have these words done to us. Our grief needs to be lifted if we're going to have a productive relationship. And then to wash the mud from your legs, that just means that all of the baggage you carry, all of the crap that's in your mind and your head, we have to somehow remove all of that before we can continue on our relationships. At the same time, this says we're going to gather the bones of all of the people who got hurt. And this is very important, particularly in the era of repatriation. We've had to go back and gather all of the bones of our ancestors that were in museums, put them back in the ground because it's an old wound between our people. It's hard to talk about the seventh generation when we're suffering from this old wound. So by gathering up the bones and putting them back in the ground, covering it over, and make amends for what took place, and as you say, I lay this wampum belt over their grave, so let's move on from there. It's very important. As was mentioned earlier, treaty making. In our language, we don't really have a word for treaty. The best thing we seem to be able to say is it's a completed matter. We've come to one mind on this. It's a very old tradition among the native nations, as we can see in this 1666 French drawing. Although we have these family clans that are named after the animals, and they're actually, the top one is a bear, even though it kind of looks like a pig. Maybe it's more about the French than us. Meeting around the council fire. And then at the bottom we see the Bear clan and the Beaver clan meeting, and the Bear is offering this wampum belt to them. So in 1666, they were able to at least recognize this was the tradition. How well they understood it is another matter. And so therefore our wampum belts are encoded with this concept of a chain, of people linking arms together. If we all stood in a big circle and interlinked our arms, it creates a strong presence. So in this wampum belt, like the one on the top of the United Nations, it shows the 6 nations have renewed their link after the Revolutionary War. Inside each square, which represents the individual nations, is this diamond. It represents the fire. So there's an encoding in the wampum belts, and sometimes they're a little difficult to read because a lot of these have been taken away for about 100 years and restored to us. But the 2 main ones upon which treaty making, treaty relationship as our premise, are these 2 belts here. And one has now become very famous for it's called the 2-row wampum we see with the 2 rows. And the other one then with the figure holding this belt, which sometimes we call the friendship belt, or it's the belt by which we linked arms with our treaty partner, in this particular case with the British government. So these 2 belts have been very important to understand the nature of our treaty making. The 2-row began, I think actually the date was 1614, in which we met with the Dutch at the confluence of the Hudson and the Mohawk rivers, and somehow they were able to come to an agreement. But the primary motivation was because we met the French a few years earlier, and we saw for the first time firearms. And our people, being naturally intelligent and beautiful, said, let's not go there, let's make peace. So they chose this symbol here of the 2-row wampum to manifest that idea. And if you're familiar with this, imagine then on one row, one path, is the ship of the Europeans and now their descendants. On the other path then is our ship, the native canoe. Now you look at this old belt, which we did repatriate from NMAI years ago. It's a little tattered and torn. I'd like to think it's because of active use over the last 400 years, but maybe it also symbolizes our relationship, which has become a little tattered and torn. But they said there was some founding principle between there. These 2 vessels were tied together and going to go down the river of life together. And what links them is this chain. And there's 3 links to that chain. First one stands for friendship, that we have to be friends with our neighbors. Second is we have to use our good mind. We have to always think about this justice that John Mohawk was talking about in order to establish, hold, maintain peace. This was the 3 principles of treaty making when it began, at least from the Haudenosaunee point of view. This is actually a belt William Penn and the Delawares. It kind of manifests this symbol of the 2 people holding hands together. But in reality, that little line between them, that's like the wampum belt that seals this agreement. So it's the very same thing. But we'll take a hold of each other's hands, or sometimes they say their arms, in order to become strong like brothers. So the diplomatic language in treaty making, because it was men, is about brothers, and the nations were viewed as brothers, not as father and son, but as brothers. And this then is called the covenant chain. The covenant chain becomes the second manifestation of that relationship, and this belt was given to us by the English, and I think 1754, but it really dates back to 1664, 67. And you can see here in the design, and there's two figures there. Oftentimes we see it this way, but in the native tradition, we hold the wampum belt and do the reading. The dark figure represents the crowned head of the government we're dealing with. You can barely see a little white square there representing his or her heart. The other figure represents the native leaders. And as you'll notice, we're all heart, man. I can tell you, so we got a whole lot. We must have been to give away so much land. So this covenant relationship becomes a reoccurring theme then in the colonial diplomacy because it's symbolizing this link of chain, manifested in this wampum belt, but it was also a very real tool by which negotiations could take place. But what they said is interesting. When we read these belts, it will put your mind at ease. You know, to hear what our ancestors had to say, you'll finally say, oh, now I understand where we're coming from. So the lack of wampum literacy, I think, has really hurt our treaty-making process because I can't tell you how many times we have a negotiation with government officials and they keep saying, oh, I didn't know that. Two-row covenant chain, yeah, I never heard about that. In reality, the historic and legal record is full of these references. So in order to have a modern-day reconciliation through the covenant chain, we have to do these three things with are represented in the chain. First, we have to have mutual respect. And boy, is that difficult in this era. How can we trust the federal government one more time? Now think about it. And but if we don't have that respect, we can no longer trust each other. I find it ironic that they call it a trust relationship that turned out to be pretty distrustful. I mean, so like we have to find a way to renew those two things and if we're ever going to have ongoing friendship. So these wampum belts and the words are representing this great aspiration for the future, but they did give us some tools of how to negotiate that future. I think it's important. So you're going to see many manifestations of this same idea. Now the concept of the covenant chain is also the king, the queen, the president wants our attention, he would shake the chain. And it would reverberate all the way from where their council fire is to ours. And we would turn to attention. And we usually say, okay, now what do they want? Well, more land. I want us to go knock somebody on the head on their half. Or whatever. And then when things are done to us, we would shake the chain, and shake the chain, shake the chain. We always got a busy signal. I don't know what it was, but it never quite seemed to connect. So the modern manifestation, and particularly in Canada, of I don't know more, is just the shaking of the chain to try to get people's attention. So this is a very profound treaty relationship we inherited from the English, and the French, and the Dutch, manifested in many different ways. The difference with the Haudenosaunee, we still have a covenant chain relationship with the Crown in Great Britain for my relatives that live in Canada. And we also still have one with the United States, but as you can imagine, sometimes it makes it difficult. The other tradition that came involved in treaty making was this concept of covering the grave. No matter what harm has been done between our people, including murder or death as a result of war, we had to heal that wound. We had to recognize the harm done and had to provide some kind of taking responsibility for that act. And then you had to come up with a way of a restitution, some kind of payment, which in the old days were wampum because wampum was so precious. You have to remember that wampum has this ability, we believe, to capture the words that are spoken over it. So when you pick it up again and you're good-minded, the words in the belt will come through our speaker and shared with us once again. So it's not just oral memory, because, you know, I'm getting older, I forget a few things too, but it's encoded in the belt, it's captured in the belt, so that we'll never lose that. Only if we lose our language will we lose the understanding. But the issues have to be laid to rest, the tragic issues. In Canada, they're trying to wrestle with the residential school issues. How do we put that to rest? Because there's so many walking wounded. But we have to find a way to move on. We can no longer be captured as victims of our history. We can't be looked at as wards of the government. We have to move past all of that stuff, but apply these principles for the future. It was such a profound matter. These are the personal symbols of Sir William Johnson. He was the Imperial Indian Agent headquartered in Albany. But look at the symbol of the one that he has there, the chain and these hands representing the Six Nations and the British hand. In there we see the canoe and the ship. We can see the council fire burning. We can see the pipe being used. And we can see the tree of peace that was planted there. These were common symbols of our language. So I believe it's no coincidence that the early Americans picked the pine tree, which was our symbol of peace, picked our eagle, which is the guardian of that, because their primary treaty relationship was with the native nations that believed these symbols to be true. But like all treaty relationships, they're kind of like a marriage. It doesn't always work well. Sometimes you've got to negotiate it. Sometimes you need a counselor. And the wampum was able to say, remember what we said 100 years ago? Remember what we said 50 years ago? So let's renew this way. Let's find a way to bring these old ideas back. And this is an example of that treaty. In 1774, I dare say this is probably this could be perceived as the first treaty the United States made, but they made a treaty with us to try to keep us out of the war that was coming. It says we brightened the chain of friendship. That's what the belt is called. And brightening it means we're going to polish it. We're going to make it new. We're going to remember the words that are in there. Now, the Americans inherited that chain from the British, and so we'll hold fast to each end. And so as long as the clouds shall produce rain and the earth corn, and our relationship will continue. So this is kind of the metaphorical dialogue, but everybody kind of meant it. Except we got a little suspicious, despite the covenant chain. So this painting here, done about 1792, we see the Haudenosaunee speaker standing over the council fire, and our delegates on one side, but there's also British delegates in the back with their red coats, and the Americans there, sitting there in the chairs. Behind the Americans are these guys in big hats. Guess who they are? They're Quakers. Because what we said is, we're a little suspicious of the way this treaty is being interpreted to us. And we believe the Quakers had a genuine heart and interest in the truth. So we would ask the Quakers, would you be our eyes and ears to tell us that what the Americans saying is true? What the British saying is true? Was it accurately translated? So we always needed a disinterested third party to make sure that the terms of the treaty were well said. And like I mentioned, smoking the pipe's important, so you're going to see, I think, this big pipe with a big long curve. I think it's in the exhibition, because smoking that silver pipe is a manifestation. What the British did is they turned the covenant chain into a silver chain. First it was a rope, then it was an iron chain, and then they made it into the silver chain. Polishing silver to make it bright is manifested then in these pipes when you smoke them, or in the peace metals that we see. Okay, sometimes they got a little chintzy and made them out of other material, but the silver is very important. Look how big these first ones are. And I think there's an example of this upstairs. George Washington there, the natives smoking the pipe, but if you read the iconography, the encoding of it, you'll notice George Washington has his hand on his sword, and the native has thrown his tomahawk to the ground. They're trying to change the nature of that, and in the background, we see a man plowing with a horse. Now, the Haudenosaunee were great farmers. We've always been great farmers. But Washington was saying, return to farming, and let's put an end to the fight between us. But remember, we had these two chains, and so we had divided loyalties. During the Revolutionary War, my father's relatives, who were Mohawks, fought against my mother's relatives, who were Tuscaroras. Same thing happened in the War of 1812. Well, in the 1950s, they made up and made a few kids, and so we're kind of lucky about that. In 1922, one of our chiefs, named Diskahe, or Levi General, tried to take the case of the Haudenosaunee to the newly formed League of Nations. We see him standing there, even though he kind of looks like a Wild West native, and you can see those two belts, these same two belts, the two-row and the covenant chain, were the ways that he tried to say, this is our relationship to Great Britain. Canada's interfering with the conduct of the Haudenosaunee, so we're asking Great Britain to please interfere, or to become involved. We had paper treaties, in this case here showing this Haldimand Agreement about the land we occupy in Canada, but we also had these wampum agreements. You need to see all of that. But it's probably about writing. It's kind of a tricky language. The lawyers among you will know that. You could say things in such a way, well, it doesn't really mean what it sounds like, but it really means this. There's been some treaty minutes from a council where both the British and the Americans were there. If you read them, you'd think they were at different meetings, because they put their slant into how it was interpreted. So what's written on the parchment, what's recorded in the treaty minutes, always has to be balanced off with what is the wampum memory. Reproductions of the belts are made, as we can see here, and they become a continuing part of our identity as Haudenosaunee people, people of the Longhouse, these 5, 6 nations. And so this photograph from 1955 shows the men still holding that silver pipe from 1769 and still holding these wampum belts because they're renewing the memory they contain. Well, when the United States was formed, of course, like all things American, they had to make the biggest wampum belt we have. It's called the George Washington Covenant Belt. And it's a name, you can see that the name for George Washington translates to destroyer of towns, because he tried to destroy us in 1779. It is kind of ironic. All my life, I was born in 1950, the President of the United States has lived up to that name and has destroyed somebody's town somewhere in the world. But it's the big belt with George Washington. It's that codifies the nature of the agreement. But you have to remember, this belt was commissioned by the early Congress. It was made on purpose. It was given to us by George Washington. And the symbols there, the people of the Longhouse in the middle, the Haudenosaunee, standing together with the 13 original colony, or 13 original states. So they took that wampum ideology, manifested in this belt, to represent now the relationship between us and the United States. But a Mohawk speaker talked about this belt representing a circle of shells, because it was meant to actually be tied up and wrapped around in a circle with the 5 nations on the inside to be protected by these our allies. So we didn't relinquish our sovereign authority, but we said, we'll stop the internal fight if you now protect our interests. And this was given by George Washington, and it's very important. So when you think about it, you actually have this treaty document that's held by George Washington. His words and that aspirations of the Congress are put into that and given to us, becomes part of our living memory. And the treaty is manifested then in many ways. So we see here a Tonawanda chief a long time ago holding the Seneca version of the treaty. And with the Canandaigua Treaty, there's actually 3 written versions, 3 parchment documents that have survived. And then we see Leon Shenandoah, Onondaga chief, looking at this bundle of cloth. It makes you wonder why. What's up with that? Well, one of the articles of the treaty is that we're supposed to be given $5,000 worth of animal husbandry goods. I couldn't understand what that was, and I thought a little kinky thing going on back then. But it turned out that it meant, implements of farming, how to make a domestic life. That was George Washington's aspiration. So every year, the United States, in these budget negotiations, has to say $5,000 worth of goods has to go to the Haudenosaunee recognition of our treaty relationship. It turns out they buy the cheapest muslin cloth you can get, and they kind of keep it for a while, and then they send it up to us. I think it was 1956 when the U.S. asked the Haudenosaunee, how about if we just give you a cash buyout of this? We'll give you, $150,000. Now, in 1956, that was a pretty good pile of cash. But what the women in the community decided, no. As long as that treaty cloth is coming from Washington, D.C. to the Onondaga Nation to be distributed to the Haudenosaunee, there stands a chance that they'll remember the rest of the articles of that treaty. If we stop the flow of cloth, it may end the dialogue about that. So it's interesting that a cheap cloth can be very important. So we've used these treaties and this discussion many times, and we come to Washington. We used to come every time there was a new president. We'd bring our wampum belts, and we would describe to him, this is the nature of our relationship between you and the Haudenosaunee. I think that came to an end right after 1924. Anybody know what happened then? They passed a law that declared that we could be citizens of the United States. And in legal thinking, you can't have an international treaty with your own citizens. So there was this shift in American thinking. Well, if we just make them citizens, maybe then things will change. So and they were coming down here during the era of termination because they said, no, we don't want our relationship with the federal government terminated, but our relationship is founded in these wampum belts, not in that little amount of goods that flow to our community. So the paper treaties are very important manifestations of that, we heard earlier. However, sometimes what it says and what we think it says are 2 different things. And at the same time, just about every treaty has been broken one way or another, but it's a relationship. It's not just about, did that sentence get perverted by some activity? Because in our treaties, there is this problem-solving, diplomatic, and negotiating structure. Here's how you can deal with that. But that's kind of come to an end. So this photograph shows when they're protesting the violation of the Canandaigua Treaty in 1794, when they built the Kinzua Dam that took a lot of Seneca land. And the United States then kind of rationalized, well, yes, it's true, treaties are the law of the land, Yes, this treaty was duly authorized, but it's now in the interest, the common interest of the United States, to abandon that principle for this good over here. And so we're always stuck with their principles being the guiding principle on that. So our covenant chain has grown very rusty over the last century. And in the old days, you used to say, let's knock that rust off. Let's find a way to polish that. But sometimes I almost think it's been abandoned. It's not the first time. 1659, it's a long time ago. So Mohawk speaker is in Albany. And he says, they say we have been here before and made an alliance, the Dutch. The Dutch say we are brothers and are joined together with chains. But that only lasts as long as we have beaver furs. Once we have something to offer, then they want to negotiate. After that, we are no longer thought of, but much will depend upon it when we shall need each other. Today, the beaver has been replaced by cigarettes, tax-free gasoline, and the hope that someday you'll get rich winning at a casino. 1819, after the War of 1812, Red Jacket mimicked that. He echoed this. We thought that all the promises made by one president are handed down to the next. We're a little foolish in that thinking. We do not change our chiefs as you do. Our chiefs are put in for life, and they're monitored by the women, our clan mothers. There's a very interesting relationship between the two. On our part, we expect to comply with our engagements. The Haudenosaunee have persistently said this, no matter what. Despite the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, we say we are still going to try to uphold our covenant chain relationships with the United States. And you've heard that our treaty with the United States, the Canandaigua Treaty, here's the Belt of Wampum to confirm that treaty. So Red Jacket is standing there, 1819, holding that George Washington Covenant Belt. This holds our hands together. And then here too is the parchment. He also had the written paper. You know its contents. I won't open it. You don't need to. Now the tree of friendship is decaying. The symbol of our relationship is starting to fall over. It says that it's falling fast, and it's your fault. So what are you going to do about it? You just going to let it crash on the ground and destroy this couple of centuries of negotiation and diplomacy, or are we going to do something? My great-grandfather, the guy I'm named after, Richard Hill, he was a Tuscarora chief at Six Nations, and he was given an assignment back in the 1880s, find all of the treaties that we could, locate all of the wampum belts, and let's see what is the nature of our relationship. My great-grandfather was then given that responsibility. And I kind of skipped a generation, and it came to me. It's been my responsibility. Seek out the wampum belts, look at these treaties, let's see what they say. And over those 4 generations, I'm amazed at the hope that our people have, that someday this will be meaningful, someday off in the future. And we keep trying to remind the governments about that. This is a photograph of my daughter. She's 9 years old today. And she's standing in front of this monument in Ohsweken at Six Nations. And behind her, etched into the stone, as you can see, these 2 belts, the covenant chain, the friendship belt, and the Truro. And its meaning is really etched into it, really in our genetic memory. We hold true to that. But it would be my hope that my daughter and her granddaughter don't grow up asking the same questions that my great-grandfather asked. My grandfather said, when is this going to become true? We need to have more than hope and expectations of the future, because we know these treaties have not always been manifested well. Here's a good example. In 2010, the Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team was refused the right to board an airplane to go to England in order to compete in the World Lacrosse Tournament. The Haudenosaunee, we travel on our own passport. We devised this many years ago. Each comes with a picture of a very beautiful looking person, and but it's all written in Onondaga. I went to England one time trying to use this passport, and I actually got deported because they wouldn't accept it. Later, when I traveled with the Iroquois Nationals about 15 years ago, we got in with this passport. We played against England, played against Australia, the United States, Canada. But because of Homeland Security issues have arisen, and now our passport is declared a fantasy document under the law, which means we're pretending we're a nation. So if we're going to manifest our treaty relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the United States, between the Haudenosaunee and Great Britain, we've got a great opportunity coming, because those World Games are going back to England, our treaty partner, and we need your help. We need the help of the President. We need the help of the Department of State. We do need the help of the Canadian Foreign Affairs. Because wouldn't it be great, all of these years after these covenant chain relationships are made, that our team, representing the citizens of our nation, are able to take the field and play against those others. And when you see these games, it's amazing because all of their flags fly, but also the Haudenosaunee flag. So the passport is a very important manifestation of that. Ironically, in June of 2010, Queen Elizabeth II was visiting Canada, and she reminded Canada of their treaty relationship with the Haudenosaunee. Apparently she didn't tell their customs office before she left that this is still valid, and our people were denied. Hillary Clinton got involved, and she did offer a one-time use of our passport where we're saying, well, we're not going away. We were the people that your ancestors met. We're the people who made these treaties with you, and now we're asking you to recognize that in real ways. So the $5,000 cloth is one thing, but to really manifest the aspirations of these treaties is very important. I believe not only to the future of the integrity of the United States and Great Britain, but also to our people, so that someday my great-grandchildren can still proudly say, we are the Haudenosaunee, citizens of our own governments. We've been this way for a long time, and we don't have any desire to change. So with that, the treaties are important because it provides us an avenue, an opportunity to explore what this means in very real ways. It cannot just be something that's manipulated in court, because we often lose there when you leave it to other people to determine the nature of these. And our wampum belts are never presented in court, our understanding of that, despite the aspiration that our understanding of the treaty is important. Now, these are replicas of the belts, and hopefully on November 11th, the Haudenosaunee are going to bring back the real versions of these belts here, because November 11th is the anniversary of the Canandaigua Treaty. Onondaga Nation just sent out wampum runners to the White House, inviting the President or his designee to come to this commemoration, so stay tuned. If this is going to have any impact, November 11th will give us some indication, because every year we gather up at Canandaigua to recite the terms of this treaty, and we would invite you there. I don't know if we're going to have some event here, but hopefully this exhibition, remember what I talked about, the wampum lot in Philadelphia? Now the wampum lot is here. This will be the place during the course of this exhibition where we can really gather together, gather our minds together, and hopefully come together with one mind. What is the true nature, the aspirations, and the expectations that these treaties provide for all of us, because we're all treaty people. These treaties were made not just for our benefit, but for your benefit as well. So I appreciate the time I've had here. I'd like to acknowledge Suzanne Harjo. If it wasn't for her grand vision and dogged determination, this would never come about. And I also have to acknowledge that Kevin Gower having the courage to bring this kind of exhibition here to NMAI. When I first worked here years ago, this was the kind of thing that we imagined would take place. So I'm so happy to be here today to be able to be part of this celebration. And then hopefully next time I see you, we'll be in England beating the United States in lacrosse. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, for your engaging and thoughtful presentation.